welcome today to Liam Gillick and JJ Charlesworth. I'm delighted that you brought this talk here. Thank you, Liam, for that. And it's great to see Maureen Paley here as well, who's always been helpful in putting these talks on. So thank you to you, Maureen, and thank you, JJ, for agreeing to do this. Just to say that Liam Gillick's exhibition Margin Time opens at Maureen Paley's gallery on Monday, and I just give you an intro on Liam. He's exhibited worldwide at the Whitechapel Gallery, London in 2002, Palais de Tokyo 2005, and a major mid-career retrospective at Kunsthalle Zurich and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago 2008-2010. Let alone mention of Venice and the German Venice Biennale in the German Pavilion. He's been nominated for the Turner Prize not once but twice in 2002 and 2008. Teaches at Columbia University, New York, and the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College. JJ Charlesworth is an associate editor for Art Review magazine and regular contributor to Art Monthly, Modern Painters, and Time Out London.
It's quite a dated bio now.
It is really short, JJ, I have to say. Then it says currently teaches at the Royal College of Art.
It's out of date too.
I think you're more than that, JJ, and I'm sure the talk will be more of this, than the sum of its parts. But for now, I'd just like it if we could all welcome Liam Gillick and JJ Charlesworth.
Thanks, Trevor. I wrote that biography sometime, but it's got something to do with how time passes. And yeah. So I was trying to work out how on earth to introduce you, Liam, and or find a way into this conversation, because amongst most of the artists I've ever encountered, you're probably one of the most complicated guys I know, or complicated artists. I keep writing at the moment, when I'm writing about artists that I like, that they're complex, that their work is complex, and that it requires some kind of proper thought, feeling, attention, involvement into what it is that a good artist does. But I suddenly realised that there's an even better type of artist, and that's a complicated artist. And it strikes me it's a good term to use, and a term of actual, it's a positive term and a term of congratulations in a way, because it seems to me that for as long as I've followed your work, you try to complicate things. And I guess what I would like to get out of you, or go into a little bit further, is the logic and the reasoning and the dynamics of that approach to not accepting the terms, the given terms of the situation of making and producing and presenting art. Because I think I don't know if it's almost unique. Well, it's possibly unique, but I rarely find myself dealing with artwork which is so conscious of its situation as yours.
Yeah, but that's where I think that the thing is, this question of complexity is there was a period in the early 90s when you had a kind of art emerge that dealt with the idea of complexity, and that had something to do with sort of the way that the art context suddenly absorbs some new ideas, for example in mathematics, some simple ideas that are spread quite widely, for example about chaos theory and so on. And you did have this period, especially in America, coming out of Yale Sculpture Department, where Matthew Barney is the most kind of notable sort of legacy of that, where people felt they were dealing with complexity as a subject. When you talk about this idea of complex, I think that my temptation is to deny it, because of course that's always a useful thing to do as an artist, especially in a talk, is to deny these things. But I think that the issue is not about complexity as a kind of mesh or a system in its own right, that's a totalizing system. It's the idea of recognizing that there are layers that you're dealing with, which each one in its own right is not necessarily complex. The formal aspect of the work, or the abstract quality of the work, is often quite straightforward. Some of the ideas politically are quite straightforward. Some of the directions where the work's directed are quite straightforward. But when my way of thinking about it was always, if you see that as one layer of complexity and that as another one, if you're looking at them from a certain perspective, they're quite easy and they don't intersect and there's no problem. But if you tilt or shift somehow your perspective or your anticipation of the viewer or the user's perspective, you suddenly get layers of what appear to be complexity. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So, and strangely enough, what I think this leads to is further complexity. Because funnily enough, you smart people and people who think about art a lot are aware that they are actually also dealing with discrete elements at the same time. So the complexity truly arrives from this problem that you are aware that there's some layering going on, but you're also aware that there's an ability to kind of differentiate and unpack those layers. But when you do that, you know that you might be forced into a new perspective. So that's what I think about complexity, because the trouble is I don't want to be... I think there was that attempt to deal with complexity as a subject sort of failed.
The complicatedness is better. That's what I'm saying.
Well, things are complicated, right?
Yeah.
You know, things
Exactly.
are complicated. I mean, we saw the failure of Barack Obama the other night to express a complicated perspective. It's things are complicated. I mean, that's maybe a bad example, but he fell into the trap of trying to account for complexity within systems. And of course, it comes across as ineffective and weak. You know, so as an artist, you face the same thing sometimes. That the problem with this idea of things being complicated or having a complex perspective on your own position and your own production, it also can make you vulnerable.
Because it's almost in the same. I mean, do you find that over
As a whole.
over I don't know 20 years, you found that that's become the issue of how to kind of position oneself without resolution has become more and more evident as this thing we call maybe the art world or contemporary art has become more about asserting strong positions or positions that are effective or ways of producing which are authoritative or actually in various ways oppressive.
Yeah, but the thing is, what happens is both of us talked about art a lot, right? In a way, on and off. Yeah. Certainly a lot at the beginning. And of course, what really happened, and it's what we used to talk about as well, maybe even more, is that I emerged right at the same time as the first generation of advanced self-conscious curators. Yeah. So in fact, the problem is not so much about art itself or my intentions or the way it is or my relationship to some other, whatever this notional simple art would be. It's actually to do with the fact that in the last 20 years we've had this very peculiar upheaval of critique in a way. It's kind of critical. I always think it's like a swell because it's not like in a traditional sense like there's a big wall that wipes things out or there are these strong positions. You've got these kind of moments of things swelling up and sinking again. It's a bit like being at sea, you know, literally being in the ocean, and you get a glimpse of something and then it disappears out of you and you get a glimpse of it. And that works very well and to the advantage of certain artists who can communicate or their ideas can be communicated and shared very quickly and easily, right? Now, beyond that, you also have the issue that within this swelling of thinking and ideas and this curatorial appearances and fluxes and, you know, things floating up and crashing down again, what it's also produced is something that I find extremely interesting, which is a lack of, probably everyone in here has thought about these things a lot, but somehow it's not seen as an urgent thing. And it's something to do with the difference between an audience and the public. And I find, for example, when I go up to Bard College, to the curatorial program, and I talk to these highly intelligent, very much better read than I am, people who are thinking hard about how to think about deploying art or cultural work into the culture, they often seem to have a confusion about the difference between audience and public. So they will, so I don't know, there's something in there that I find interesting. Like, I can create an audience for anything. There's an audience somewhere for watching goats piss into my mouth, right? But the public, that's another thing. If I get goats to piss in my mouth, for the public, whatever that means, it's a very different thing. So this confusion between audience and public means that certain artists are dealing with the notional public in sync with certain curatorial strategies, and some are thinking about audience, and some are actually somewhat deconstructing both these things simultaneously. And I think the anxiety about a lot of my work in the past has been that maybe it was supposed to be engaging with the public or a multiple public. Other people's, which would be quite normal, that you'd say, well, it's a bit like dealing with conceptual art and saying, well, the failure of conceptual art is that it failed to get rid of the commodity status of the art object, and in fact, people still sell art, and conceptual art is really expensive and whatnot. And the thing with someone like me is often a misunderstanding of this issue about audience and public. Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Because, I guess in terms of upswells and a long historical overview over, say, certainly 15, 20 years, is an apparent need to replace art in a sort of functioning relationship to supposedly to a public which supposedly was dysfunctional before. That you had a kind of failed avant-gardism or a failed experimental or critical art that somehow didn't fulfill its own promise, and that for various kind of historical political reasons, you end up with the last decade and perhaps part of the decade before, where there's almost an urgency in the space, in the place of where power is deployed, to try and drag the people back into to this kind of functioning relationship and benign relationship with artistic practice. Looking over the kind of terms that you've used, I think, when I first started to kind of read and look at your work and try to work out what kind of vocabulary was being deployed, there was very much to do with a notion of deferred temporality, about speculation about possibility within a kind of narrow historical scope. More recently, when I've been reading some of the things you've been publishing, you're tending towards, you're more interested in certain kind of vocabulary of failure, or
that might be an age problem. I'm very worried about the old man syndrome.
That would be too nice of you to argue that you're getting tired and old, and I wouldn't believe that for a minute. But the idea that one can deal with subjugation, or the idea that one is in a weak position, is certainly interesting when all around one you've got a situation where art has to be powerful or presented strongly.
But when I did the German Pavilion, a lot of the mainstream German press, the people I'd never really met before because they're not attending to the sort of thing I'd be doing, said the work was weak.
Yeah.
Now, the work was intentionally weak, so therefore it must have succeeded. But actually they meant weak. And this is very difficult. So I have had to look at some of these things a bit more carefully because...
but why do we want, or rather we, in a kind of dangerously sort of generalist way, why do we, the world, culture, or whatever, or certain kinds of cultural machineries want art to be strong, or want it to be effective? And I think certainly that's the kind of problematic that has played out almost now to exhaustion in terms of talking about participatory art, or art which has a certain kind of agenda, purpose, has an activist role, has a desire to change things. We're getting a bit tired.
I think it absolutely should.
That generation.
I think that it's essential, and I don't think you could never legislate it away or stop it. That in fact it's going to happen. But the thing is, it depends who's doing it, and who has cultural permission, who should be doing it. And I'm in a complicated position in relation to that. I think it shouldn't necessarily... I have to do certain things which show a self-consciousness of my own implicated position within the culture, and I should not be posturing, to be honest. I mean, I do posturing all the time, of course, but I have to... that's not productive for me. There are other people who should be making clear borders and limits and saying this is not enough. And I'll, like in the Agamben idea of proximity, I'll stand beside them as they walk, but I should not be taking the place. So this is a difficult thing to talk about because, of course, I don't want to muddle up too many things, but a lot of it, to me, again, comes back to this lack of focus or ability to differentiate between an audience and a public in a sophisticated way. And maybe it's because there was so much focus on it that somehow what it's devolved into is a kind of pseudo-ethical battle about who possesses the better story to talk to a kind of mythical group that sort of isn't there or isn't listening. And we saw this around Occupy Wall Street and so on, and the anxieties around that. And what worried me about Occupy Wall Street, for example, was not its existence, or not the urgency to have certain kind of collectivized slogans and so on. It's that that the art group in New York wanted me to come and explain the art world to them, the art market. And I think that's what worries me. These kind of things worry me a little bit. So it's not that I'm interested in weakness. It's just that I'm wary of situations where you reflect back to people what they already know. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I need to change my. The most recent things I've been writing have got very little to do with the daily contingent realities of living. They've been about abstraction, about parallelism, about the idea of the contemporary. I'm off in sort of la la land, to be honest, at the moment. But I think someone needs to do it, because they don't need me to explain how the art market works. It's not necessary. We know that. It's all.
Yes, but for example,
what I mean?
Reading the essay you wrote on what is the contemporary, or this kind of bizarre usage of the term contemporary, and the fact that nobody calls themselves a contemporary artist, but everybody talks to someone else about contemporary art. It's clear that there's an issue about the way in which an idea has some kind of problem about who it's from rather than who it's for.
Absolutely.
That you have a situation where everybody doesn't take responsibility by for this thing that's happening, by deferring to it as if it has some kind of quirky or conditional quality called the contemporary, say. I mean, if we go around just talking about art, which is effectively what it is, then we've got to take responsibility for the fact that it exists and it happens. Using a term like the contemporary sort of brackets things.
Yeah, but it's the longest lasting term to describe the art of its time since since the Enlightenment or something. Maybe I'm wrong, but it's extremely effective, because in the end, Hito Steyl and I are both contemporary artists, and so is John Curran, and so is Valentin, whatever his name is. And the thing is, if you try and step outside it, you are actually extending the potential of contemporary art. You're not stepping outside it. So the thing is, of course, this is all based on a breakdown of hierarchies and authority within cultural practice that was entirely necessary. So, of course, it feels it's a tricky one to deal with. I tried to teach a course on contemporary art at Bard College, because I realized that the curatorial department wasn't actually teaching a course on contemporary art. So I thought it'd be funny, partly, and also useful to actually have a course on contemporary art. So I invited, the way I did it, because I'm sort of busy but lazy, like a lot of people, but I thought I'd invite other people, and I had lots of money, so I could invite Alex Albero and Tom McDonough and all these different people to come. And I said to them, for 9 weeks, and I said to them, I want you to talk about the origins of contemporary art, because if we can work out the origins of contemporary art, then we might be able to work out whether we are it anymore, or whether there should be another term and whatnot. And they almost all of them, the students were going nuts, because it would be week 3, and someone would come in and they'd start talking about Fluxus, and they'd start talking about John Cage, and they'd start talking about Duchamp's speech to the whatever association, right? The Art Historians Association in 1957, where he talks about it. And everyone did the same thing, virtually, with a few exceptions. And of course, people were going insane. But what was really interesting is you realize this generation of people who are now professors, they're the first professors of contemporary art history that we really have had, ever. This is really phenomenal. The students of Buchloh and Krauss, and even of Hal Foster, and to a certain extent, are now running departments, and they are professor of contemporary art. And they actually they have identified a starting point. And I find this really interesting. So
where was it then? Where did they find it? Which starting point?
The starting point hovers
what's
around
the
teachings
date
about
is?
1957, 58, and a lot of it centers around Cage and Cunningham, and it's a very American, North American view of things, and also Duchamp's speech that I zoned out, frankly, after a while, after the 5th time of having it, and I can't remember. It's the famous speech where he talks about what it is to be in.
So they located it a long time ago, rather
and then,
than say
of course,
1976.
Absolutely.
Like
well, it's actually, it could also be, 1968, because that's when or 67. It's also late 60s where you get a group of people again, I'm going to be talking a lot from a US perspective. It's just because it's my experience. And also we didn't have a museum of contemporary art in London, so I can only talk about it. It's got a certain drive that's linked to a particularly complicated American sense of cultural responsibility and its relationship with progress or something. So you have, for example, in the late 60s, you have the emergence of museums of contemporary art, and they always work in these cities in parallel with an established institute, which was WASPI, I have to say. So, for example, the Art Institute of Chicago they were a group of people interested in what was happening now that were not really, they were uncomfortable in the institute. And so they started their own museum. And this is the second stage. If you could say that people like Alex Albero can talk about the origin, like what is it that starts this process that can continue through Donald Judd in 1963, talking about art will become more specific and more diverse, right, at the same time, which is a great statement. And of course you have all the questioning of hierarchy and so on through feminism and through post-colonialism and identity politics. At the same time you have this institutional frame that starts to appear in the late 60s, which does not collect in depth. It collects examples. It's very local. It will tolerate in its collection what we might, not objectively, but we might say you'd need local knowledge to sort of appreciate it. And it skews a little bit towards a sort of emerging worthiness. You'll have already in the late 60s a reasonably high representation of not just men with beards kind of thing. You have other people too. So this was interesting. We did establish this at least.
Yeah. Well, obviously, we're sitting in an Institute of Contemporary Art, and that perhaps is one of the kind of clues that there's a point at which you need a kind of para-institution to cope with something that's going on. There's a process that, historically we have a process of making living activity in the arts, or living art, or current art, whichever, whatever we want to look to as a term, into something which has a kind of manageable relationship to a certain kind of institutionality. And I wonder whether that's starting to unravel. Maybe it's maybe it's too narrow to discuss it in terms of.
How do you mean?
That if you're talking about it being a post-war thing, then you can point to the fact that the post-war is the place in which, in the West, we have liberal social democratic institutions evolved to manage certain kinds of, conflict, or certain kinds of dissent or disparity between. So the idea that modern art is contestatory and is difficult and awkward and rebellious after the war, it's slowly brought into some kind of coherent, not polite dialogue, but a certain kind of managed dialogue. And there is, it strikes me that a lot of what you do is to force the tension about the kind of the accommodation and management of
absolutely.
Dissent. Or, that would be, again, slightly too cut and dried way of describing it. But there is an aspect. I think what's important is in the elusiveness and the processes, the strategic processes of, again, deferment or absenteeism of certain sorts in your work.
Yes, exactly.
That there is a kind of attempt to manage what is actually a quite perverse situation.
Right. So let me try and explain how and why that's the case. Firstly, I think that I'm interested in looking at actually what really takes place.
Yeah.
And some of that started from a very early realization that one of the great battles of the 20th century, for example, was not the battle between left and right. It was a battle between speculation and planning. And, of course, speculation has some aspects of planning in it. You gear the neoliberal economy in order to make speculation have more potential, and also planning has some speculative kind of projection involved in it. But I became very interested in that as an idea, and therefore what would happen is I started to think a lot more about these kind of things. So the territory I was considering a lot was speculation, strategy, compromise, projection, all the things that I think actually do affect the way certain developed societies function, right? And this became the territory of interest in the work, basically, rather than sex and death, or like sex or death, or whatever it's supposed to be, or the super subjective, or any of these things, some of which have extremely important and valuable. It just happened to be my area of interest with these other things, and that's what, and seems to make it, the work sometimes hard to read. And the other key to it is that primarily I'm interested in production rather than consumption. And if you can say that, you know, in a simplistic way, like, okay, think of the Venice Biennale. Across the street from me was Dragset and Elmgren, and you could say that that show was about consumption. They did a kind of collector's house and a dead person in a swimming pool, and it was about consumption and taste and so on. And mine was about production. So the thing is, if you read my work in through a frame of the analysis of and of course production and consumption are entirely related from a Marxist perspective. You can't, you know, it's the commodity issue is the interesting thing for me. But I'm focusing much more on production than consumption. And this is how I could get out of that, the irony trap, which, having been a reasonably interested student going to art school in the 80s, you know, the safest thing to do was be ironic, pretty much.
Yeah.
And I kept a bit of irony, but meaning also from like what you could call serious irony, meaning that isn't it ironic, you know, an ironic response to the failure of modernism, for example, that your work would always embody this irony. I wanted to get out of the irony trap, partly because I felt that it would sort of lead to Richard Prince being in court against a guy taking photographs of Rastafarians, worrying about at what level was this a mark of authorship or not, and whether or not it's even worth arguing about, which in a way is a phenomenal thing that Richard Prince has done by barely arguing in court about his apparent, he's not even claiming it to be an appropriation. It's gone so far in the kind of imploded irony that it's sort of, you know, folded into itself.
But in those terms, it's irony in the point of consumption, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, talking about objects which are ironic, that deploy themselves as a kind
Absolutely.
of internally failed. But you know, tell me a bit more about, or work out a bit more this issue of the distinction that you see between, because everybody produces objects, but if they're ironic objects at the point of consumption, a different irony at the point of production is something else, right?
I think it's extremely dangerous for progressive-minded people to start from the position that it's either an end game or it's over, or there was a point when it was better. Yeah. And you sort of did it yourself a little bit, and it seems logical, right? There was a point when there was an avant-garde and it was more profound. But of course, it's hard to know. To be honest, it's really hard to know if that was the case or not. Especially if you make a barrier like Second World War, because of course we know that in the 30s there was a massive shift towards neoclassicism in art, even Picasso, you know, with the chubby kind of people wafting around, you know, and so on. That's also, you know, the more hardcore you come down to it, you start to look at like 3 weeks in 1919 or something, and it's getting a little weird. So as an artist, I'm much more, I don't know, it's a hard thing to talk about, but there's a lot of problems in here about assuming there was a more authentic moment.
I wouldn't say it was more authentic. I'm just saying there was a different set of arrangements, that's all.
Yeah, but I wish I could be sure that was true. I think it seems to be true, and it smells true, but we know that the critics of the time tended towards a more heroic, had more heroic tendencies, and were making larger claims for the work. Mm-hmm. What we have now is a situation where people make softer or smaller claims for the work. And this is part of the contemporary amoeba, as it were, that kind of engulfs everything, even if you're trying to step outside it, is that I'm the first generation of artists who's managed to work for this long without anyone really writing very hard about the work, in a way. You write about the potential of the work, you write about the curatorial context of the work, you write about some soft sort of theoretical thing about the work, but you don't really deal with the work. You don't make enormous claims for the thing in itself or the potential of the thing. So in a way, you're left free to really do what you want for a long time. And that is also a quality of the contemporary. The endless kind of, as my German friend calls it, pubertarian quality of the contemporary. I think he means teenage, late teenage, but
yes,
pubertarian endlessness.
Things. But the weird thing, of course, is that whilst people make fewer claims or less grand claims for it, there's everybody's much more determined to have a lot more of this stuff and to have it imposed at a much higher level than before. But that's a fairly long conversation. But I don't know if I wanted to break off and ask you about specifically the film that you prepared for the show that's coming up next week, because that might be a good way of arresting what becomes what Gregor wants, which is for us to talk all afternoon, all night.
No, you said 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
No? 3 months.
We just sit here forever, basically.
The film?
Yeah.
Okay, so
because we want to do some questions and answers, certainly, I think.
When I was invited to do, this is actually a show from Antwerp from a couple of years ago. When I was invited to do the German Pavilion for in the Venice Biennale, right, in 2009, one of the reasons I found it interesting is I'd actually written one of the catalogue essays for the previous German Pavilion in Venice, and that was actually the first thing I thought, that this was interesting, that someone who'd written one of the texts would then do it the next year. It was completely unnoticed. No one from any press ever said, this is weird. This is the guy who wrote the essay about Isa Genskin, and now he's actually doing it. That seemed to me sort of much more of an interesting problem than being British, for example, which was the main thing. Just anecdotally, I mean, it was really a fascinating process because as people in the audience who are not British know about living here is, and I meet people and they say, yeah, I live in London, it's really fantastic, I see all these people, it's really interesting. And as someone coming from London, I think, my God, how are you managing? You know, it's much more problematic than that. But of course what they're doing is they're meeting a certain group, they're seeing a certain side of things, and so on. And I'd had this experience in Germany for nearly 20 years that I'd never met the other people, you know, the people that are really running a certain form of the culture and have a certain view of what German culture means. So one of the first interviews I did was with the Munich evening paper. And the first question was, Mr. Gillick, what makes you the best? And of course, I'd never come across this kind of... It never occurred to me that the culture writer for the Munich evening paper would even... They were assuming that you must be the best. And then their follow-up was, when you win the Golden Lion for Germany, how will you feel? It wasn't if. It was really an interesting assumption. So it put me in this odd position that I had to... initially I thought, therefore, I wondered if there was some way that you could be within this set, as it were, of people within the influence of the German critical context, and also be outside it at the same time. This interested me a lot, because it's very hard to be, in a way, a German exile. It's a very complicated notion, and it doesn't exist it exists in literature since the 18th century, but it's a very hard one to talk about. I've been reading a lot of Hermann Hesse recently, so you have the figure of the internal exile, like the Steppenwolf, for example, is the internal exile within German culture, for example. And you have people who have to flee, for example, of course, or get out. And that's another thing, but that's not the same as being an exile or a dissident or being separate within the group. So I was thinking, well, the first thing I thought was to be slightly evil, actually, especially considering the building. And I thought about trying to identify the most interesting 5 young German artists that were working at the moment, right, in Germany at that point, and kind of document them and photograph them and have 5 mannequins made that were perfectly lifelike and just stand them in the pavilion. So at the opening, the doors would open, everyone would walk in, and the work would kind of disappear. And also you would damage these people forever. They would forever have been the 5 best artists in Germany in 2009. And they would, of course, forever not be able to be that, in a way. It would be this negative, positive and they would disappear when everyone was there, and they'd reappear when everyone wasn't there. So anyway, to cut a long story short, I then started to think about, I knew that Steve McQueen was going to do the British Pavilion, Mark Lewis was going to do the Canadian Pavilion, and I can't remember what else, but it was like the return of nice men who read occasionally. Do you see what I mean? It was like, seemed like a not terribly exciting little chunk of, it wasn't going to change very much, but I knew they'd make films. So I thought, I'm going to make a film, because I don't see why I shouldn't be like them. I want to be one of these men, right? And I want to make like an out-of-focus film about something. And so then I thought, well, what can I do? And I was thinking, what doesn't really exist in German post-war culture? And one of the things that doesn't really exist, it does in a way, slightly, is science fiction. Because you can't really have classic sort of Anglo-Saxon science fiction within the German post-war context. It's all stormtroopers and like dark planets and people stomping around in black helmets. It's just not on. And then the other aspect of it is it's very Eastern, like Stanislav Lem and so on. It's got a very particular melancholy within it that's not, it's complicated. Now, of course, there are German science fiction writers. There were a couple of series in the 60s, 70s. There's one or two things. But I thought that's what I'd do, make a science fiction film that couldn't be made. So Margin Time is the film. And while I was thinking of what to do in 2008, at the same time, I live next to the United Nations, and they have a sculpture garden, right? And it would have things like a revolver with the barrel in a knot and things like that. It had all these symbols of peace, like doves. It has a brilliant sculpture of the famine boat, with people. And it has two extraordinary sculptures, one from the Soviet Union and one from East Germany, that look like that famous Nazi sculptor, whose name I never remember. Like pioneering young men doing, it's a weird stance. It's something like that. So I don't know what that means. That's something from classical sculpture, right? This hand thing.
I think so.
Anyway, so they started, while I was thinking about this, they started clearing the sculpture garden. So they're kind of erasing, it's like the post-war symbolism is over. And they started building a temporary structure to house the UN while they renovate the main tower and the main thing. So I just started getting up very early in the morning before the workers arrived and filming them. And for me, this started to become like the construction of this sort of base, like this thing, this construction thing. And at the same time, I realized that Philip Johnson, who built the restaurant at the Four Seasons, the Mies van der Rohe building, and of course is the Glass House, but also flirted heavily with National Socialism, was one of those suckers who would go to Germany in 1936 and say it's, very spectacular, these Nuremberg rallies. They're awfully nice. The Mr. Hitler, it's very interesting, charming. And, it was worse than that as well. Roosevelt Island, which is just across from there, he did one of the only master plans he did, which was to build a kind of, what looks a bit like Hemel Hempstead, but in New York. And at the same time, Louis Kahn, who I thought about a lot recently, the American architect, because I was going up to Bard, he had died in the toilets at Penn Station of a heart attack in like 1976 or something. And I always find this interesting, the idea of like where you can imagine him like gasping and holding his chest and thinking, I always wondered what it would be like. And those toilets are not the place to die if you can avoid it on any day. He had designed a monument to Frank FDR called the FDR Monument, and it had never been built. And worthy, rich, Upper East Side liberals, right, had decided to get it funded and get it actually made on the tip of the island. So I had these three sites: the decaying Roosevelt Island that was having its cable car from Manhattan to Roosevelt Island renovated, the building of this temporary space, the construction of the park. They started to film all these things. And then basically what you see at the gallery is the first, I guess in a way, the first part of the film. And I kind of ladled it on fairly thick, to be honest. It was very cathartic. I got rid of all the things I would have been too nervous to do in Venice. I did them the show's it's in good taste, but relatively for you know, the world of taste from art, what do you call them, art crits or tutorials? Yeah, it wouldn't get through a tutorial at Goldsmiths, this thing, or anywhere. But you know, because some of the music, for example, is the same classical composer who wrote the East German national anthem, things like that.
Thank you.
Which is a really good piece.
I'm looking forward to it. But I feel like I really could go on, which is a problem because I want to bring people in for questions. I mean, it's hard to know what to question Liam on, to be honest. So randomness is probably a good strategy. Is there a microphone?
Yeah.
So it seems to have gone very quickly this hour.
Right.
Should I guide? Yes. Hands is the best way to do it. No?
You're just trying to get out. I have a question.
For yourself?
I always like that thing. Remember that? Did you come to that Richard Hamilton talk?
No. Which one?
I interviewed him.
I think so.
He told this really great story, Richard. I like Richard Hamilton a lot, and I think he's really good. And when he came to Goldsmiths, I interviewed him, and he told a story about how once he did a talk and he thought it was really good, and there were no questions at the end, and he was really excited, and he was really pleased with himself. And then someone finally put their hand up and said, "That's all very interesting, Mr. Hamilton, but why is your work so shit?" That's really good.
But that is the difference between your public and your audience.
I guess so. Yeah.
I mean, this in a way is a public.
I'm wary of this
Rather than
complexity
audience.
thing though, because
No?
I know he suffered from it a little bit, and people would go, "Oh God, it's fucking Richard Hamilton." He's going to start going on about Braun design and Dieter Rams, things we all know about now. But when he was talking about Dieter Rams in it was like talking about someone now. You know, when he was talking about Dieter Rams was like 45 and in the middle of doing everything. It just seemed odd dealing with Duchamp and Dieter Rams simultaneously. They were completely contradictory aspects of things, not really making your own work, copying someone else's notes and re-typesetting it and doing it again, and then just staying at home and painting your house, but you're not really painting. You're working on a sort of computer that you've made yourself. It's extremely interesting work. One of the big tragedies is since Paul Schimmel left the MoCA in LA, they cancelled the Richard Hamilton touring show that was going to go in America, and it's a tragedy. It's a terrible thing. Thank God he's not around to know it. It's just devastating. But anyway, he's interesting. Sorry.
Here.
I just wanted to ask, something occurred to me. I came to the independent group conference a few months ago here, and I wondered if, Liam, you could talk about the influence of Richard Hamilton, but also primarily of the independent group in terms of your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it is extremely influential, but in a very roundabout way, because I grew up in the suburbs, and my first entry into art, or thinking about art as a meaningful actual existence, or things people actually do rather than in books, is I went to local art centres, which were not as sophisticated as the ICA, but they were these kind of, they often had blues. I was old enough that these places always had a blues concert on once a week, but they would also have maybe video things, even video or slide shows and little exhibitions, and also you could use them for political meetings and so on. And then I graduated very quickly to here. So by 15, I'm coming here because it's already, I'm not interested in art at that point. I want to see, there was a great Hungarian movie about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that has this spanking scenes in it and so on. And I used to come and see like European films. And on the way in, like now again, you'd have to see the exhibition because it would be there laid out in front of you. So what I'm saying is it comes through a roundabout way. I am the perfect subject in a way. The things they talked about a lot and the things they discussed about how you play with layering and also thinking about new sites and new ways to display art. I was absolutely ready for it and vulnerable to it. And so, yeah, I didn't see any distinction between disciplines in a strange way. And we talk about that as if that's something that has to be learnt. right? That people even now in art school, it's a big deal if you can talk about cross-disciplinary practice, even if, and how you change things. But I started from that point because I think the influence of the independent group did leak into the culture through places like the ICA in a weird way and through other forms. The side of it that I found more difficult was the art part, maybe. The art part was always either too English, its abstraction was too soft, or its claims seemed too low, and I went for certainty instead. So I became very quickly much more interested in architecture side from Britain, like Archigram and Peter Cook and things like that, for its claims, and American conceptual art, North American conceptual art from 1966 to 1972, pretty much, because it seemed to have acceleration in it. The independent group didn't seem fast enough. It seemed to sort of stake out a territory and then sort of trust that it's like the Eddie Izzard thing, like cake or death. It's like revolution or, cup of tea. And you could have, it's not a good contradiction, is it? It's like, you know what it's like, when you're a certain age, you want things to be more urgent. And I got sucked towards things that made more urgent claims.
But Britain is always in danger of being a bit of a place that you want to leave.
Yeah, but I'm not one of these weird. I'm not one of these weird. I hate Britain people.
No,
I think it's great.
It's not about hating.
Punk and different things that dates me. But you know what I mean.
No, but the idea, that they look to America not because
they
it's
did,
some
yes.
kind of holy land, but because there was a sense of, this is what things could be like, or this is the way we can think about things in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
It was far too early in many respects, wasn't it?
Yes, and also you could say that the equivalent now for some of that work is things like when Rem Koolhaas starts talking about China, and we know that's problematic. And so I know that if I'd really been around in 1956 or a bit later, I might have preferred something else, because I would say, there was always what was that, ethical, or is an ethical dilemma, this celebration plus kind of exposure, the Rainer Bannon kind of, celebrating and exposing at the same time. It's hard to tell if I would have been like an ethical munchkin and just said, I'm not having this, it's not pure enough. It's difficult.
In terms of the way things are going to be, though, it's interesting that so much of your work works around and with the idea of a temporal space, which is irresolved, which is understands that there is a dynamic, which means that things are not static or not constant, but then at the same time could go in many different ways. I mean, to bring it to a much more kind of
there's a difference between development and progress.
Yeah,
it's like you can stand in the way of development, but you can't stand in the way of progress, or something. You can hinder development. These time issues I find extremely interesting, and they've often been the thing in the work. I mean, even there was a thing where you see these gates. This was a whole body of work around Marx's first book, which was a novel, a comic novel. But that's a lot of that deals with aspects of genealogy, for example. So the perceived time as it exists within intellectual flow and influence, and the way it happens. He was trying to write his own version of Tristan Shandy in a way. It's like a mockery, but it's in a way a genealogy. And I'm interested in these flows, and I'm wary, and I think there's lots of work to be done. I'm bored of hearing that, Kirsten Brach can only be read through a filter of women that dressed up in a weird way or something. There's certain tendencies. What's happened right now as the curatorial swell kind of goes through a new phase, and something appears, but the other one still exists, but it's out of view temporarily, is the phenomena that of the art historian who starts to appear within the curatorial frame because they have verifiable information, and therefore they seem a better human being. But they need things to be historically verified in order for them to be justified. And I find this interesting, and I think it's an interesting question for curators here and artists here, what we do about that. Because in some ways that seems to make us all stronger. If you read my work through this genealogy, then it must give it permission, it must make it stronger. But of course we know that that's not how things work, in a way. So anyway, my point about that is that the people have been asking me recently, they'll look at something and say, that's interesting, what's it derived from? And okay, it's a really weird question. I think that's a new kind of question.
Do you find it more disturbing that the situation we operate in is in many ways more well administrated? That the systems that produce people who are good art historians of the contemporary, good curators of the very recent,
my thought
this somehow is not only less fun than a more chaotic situation, but points to a kind of administrative or managerial world which
I use the term
don't
gatekeeper.
really want to be in.
Gatekeeper is the one. I don't know. It's fine. I'm not against it. I think it's extremely important because people will find ways to undermine it, and will fight it if necessary or reinforce it. You know, but it's just the moment we're in. In my film, my notional film thing, although it's not really obvious from seeing it, but there's a main character, as it were, a woman, and it just happens to be. It's an affectation. I got it from reading certain things, a couple of things recently where, anyway, it doesn't matter. But she's both a gatekeeper, someone who has to be there first and last to make sure no one ever arrives alone or is the last to leave. This is the role within these zones. And she's also a spy. And for me, this seemed to sum up a certain cultural function right now. Gatekeeper, make sure no one feels alone when they arrive. No one's the first to arrive and no one's the last to leave, and a spy. And for me, this made it exciting, because I was getting bored of having these kind of pseudo-ethical battles at Bard College between the students saying, well, in Chile, we do it like this, and this is what we do, and we're much more careful about, we have a better social system. And then someone saying, well, in the Netherlands, you know, for many years we've been doing this. And you think you're all fucking insane. You're all gatekeepers, spies, and you're making sure no one's the first to arrive and the last to leave. And this is something. That's a real responsibility. And then you have to decide how you use it. And so this is what I'm playing with a little bit in the film, which people would have hated as well. So, I mean, they wouldn't have liked it any more than stupid kitchen thing. It's not the point.
So this is the Venice Biennale piece that would have been
done had I not spent so much time in the Museum of Applied Arts in Vienna looking at Greta Schutter-Lehotsky's kitchen that she designed in Frankfurt in 1928 or something, and realizing that, yeah, it's another story. We'll have to do that another time.
I think so. So I'm going to stop it there, because that was good.
Okay, fantastic.
Thank you.
I would just like to say, if you have any further questions, I'm sure JJ or Lee would be happy to answer them after this talk. But we'll wrap up now. I'd like to thank both of you for a really fantastic conversation. Thank you very much. And Liam's show opens on Monday at Maureen Paley, so do come along for that. Thank you.